Sometimes the person the whole world thinks they know is the person nobody ever really saw. Not because the image was false. Not because the performances were hollow or the smile was entirely manufactured. But because the most practiced smiles are often the ones built on top of the deepest fractures. Because the people trained earliest to appear composed are often the ones carrying the heaviest things. And because fame, for all its noise and light, can be one of the most effective hiding places a wounded person ever finds. Marie Osmond hid in plain sight for decades. Millions of people watched her. Millions more grew up with her voice in their ears and her face on their screens and the particular warmth she projected becoming part of the furniture of American life. She was the girl next door scaled to national television. She was the wholesome counterweight to an entertainment industry that seemed to be unraveling everything decent about itself. She was reliable. She was radiant. She was, by every visible measure, completely fine. But there is a question underneath all of that brightness that her life has been circling for decades. A question that does not appear in the highlight reels or the Billboard chart statistics or the glowing profiles that followed her from one reinvention to the next. A question that only surfaced in fragments, across years, each fragment more costly than the last. What was she protecting? And who was she protecting it from? The answer begins earlier than most people realize. Earlier than the television show. Earlier than the hit record. Earlier than the famous name had finished attaching itself to her identity with the permanent grip that famous names always have on the children born into them. It begins in childhood. In the years before she had language for what was happening. In the gap between what the world saw and what she was privately learning about the distance between safety and its appearance. Olive Marie Osmond was born into a family that was already a performance before she arrived. The only girl among 9 children, growing up inside one of the most recognizable entertainment dynasties in American history, she made her first appearance on national television at 4 years old. 4. Before most children have developed a coherent memory, before the architecture of identity has any real foundation to build on, she was already being seen by strangers who felt they knew her. That is not a childhood. That is an audition that never ends. And inside that relentless visibility, something happened that nobody in the audience could see. Something that would spend the next several decades quietly reshaping everything she thought she knew about herself, about men, about trust, about the meaning of being close to someone and still not being safe. She was abused. Not by family. That detail came later, in the careful clarifications that survivors often have to make because the world asks questions that survivors should never have to answer. But the identity of the person who caused the damage is, in some ways, the less important truth. The more important truth is what abuse does to a child regardless of who commits it. It does not stay in the moment. It does not respect the boundaries of memory. It spreads into identity, into the body, into the complicated emotional language a child is still trying to learn when the damage arrives. Marie would eventually describe something that reveals just how far that damage had traveled. As a young girl, she said she did not understand men. She feared them. She did not trust them. She looked at women and wondered whether that confusion meant something definitive about who she was, because trauma had scrambled the emotional vocabulary she was trying to use to read herself. That is not a small admission. That is a window into the interior life of a child trying to navigate self-understanding after the ground has been taken out from under her sense of safety. And all of this was happening while the machine kept running. At 12 years old she recorded Paper Roses. It climbed the charts with the kind of momentum that industry veterans spend careers trying to manufacture. She became the youngest female artist to reach #1 on multiple Billboard charts with a debut record. The world responded to her voice the way it always responds to something that feels both polished and genuine. With immediate, unconditional embrace. What the world did not hear inside that voice was everything it was already carrying. Because success does not dissolve trauma. It does not neutralize the wound or silence the interior noise or make the thing that happened to you in the dark feel less real in the light. What success does, when it arrives early and arrives with force, is give you a role to protect. A version of yourself that the world has decided it loves. And the pressure to maintain that version, to show up as the person people have invested their affection in, becomes its own kind of captivity. Marie stepped into that captivity and performed brilliantly inside it for years. The variety show she co-hosted with Donnie became a cultural institution. Dubbed into 17 languages. broadcast into living rooms across the world. Two young people from a famous family, polished and energetic and apparently delighted by everything, offering weekly proof that American entertainment could still be clean, warm, and worth gathering around. Millions of people watched that show and felt something settle inside them. What they were watching was also a masterclass in concealment. Not dishonesty. Not cynical performance. Something more complicated and more human than either of those things. The concealment of a young woman who had learned, through a combination of family expectation, professional pressure, and the survival instincts that trauma quietly installs, that composure was not optional. That being okay was not a feeling but a responsibility. That the show, in every sense, had to go on.
The years kept moving. The career kept expanding. Marriage came, and then divorce, and then another marriage, and then children, and then more children, and then the kind of large and complicated family life that looks from a certain distance like abundance and from the inside like an enormous amount of weight distributed across an enormous amount of love. And still the buried thing kept shifting beneath the surface. It surfaced with terrible clarity after the birth of her son. What she described was not the idealized new mother experience that her public image might have predicted. It was extreme anxiety arriving without warning. It was despair settling over her like weather. It was the inability to bond with a newborn she loved, the confusion of wanting to be present and finding herself entirely absent from the inside. It was hiding behind the familiar architecture of the smile, telling the people around her that she was fine while something fundamental was coming apart. She got in her car and drove. Not toward anything. Just away. Along the Pacific Coast Highway with no destination and no plan, because motion felt like the only remaining form of survival and staying felt impossible. That is what happens when pain has been held in silence long enough. It stops being a thing you carry and starts being a thing that carries you, that moves through you without asking permission, that forces a reckoning the public timeline was never going to allow. She got help. And getting help meant beginning to excavate. Not just the postpartum depression, which was real and which was serious and which deserved everything the treatment gave it. But what was underneath the depression? What the depression had broken open access to. The older injuries. The childhood architecture of fear and confusion and the distorted self-understanding that abuse leaves behind like sediment. Therapy meant beginning to name those things. Not all at once. Not in a single brave sentence delivered to a waiting audience. But slowly. In the way survivors actually heal, which is rarely linear and never clean and almost always costs more than anyone watching from outside can calculate. The memoir came. Behind the Smile. A title that named the mechanism before it named the wound. She disclosed the abuse. She described the postpartum crisis. She began pulling back the curtain with the deliberate, measured courage of someone who has spent years deciding exactly how much truth the world can be trusted with at once. And still the full naming took longer. Because naming is not one moment. That is the thing that the phrase finally names her abuser makes sound simpler than it is. For survivors, naming rarely arrives as a single dramatic disclosure. It arrives in layers. First you name what it did to your body. Then what it did to your mind. Then what it did to your understanding of yourself. Then what it did to your relationships, your fear, your ability to trust the people who stood close to you. You name the damage long before you can name the source, because naming the damage is how you survive long enough to name the source. Marie named the damage across years and across platforms with a consistency that the entertainment industry tends to reward less than the dramatic single revelation. She named it in her memoir. She named it in interviews. She named it on television, in the careful language of someone who has learned that precision matters when you are speaking about things this serious in spaces this public. She named what the abuse had done to her sense of herself as a child. She named the way it distorted her understanding of gender and attraction and safety. She named the postpartum collapse as a crisis that had older roots than the birth that triggered it. Each naming was its own act of courage. Each one asked the audience to replace the comfortable version of her story with something more complicated, more painful, and more true. And audiences are not always ready for that exchange. There is a particular discomfort that arrives when a public figure who has been loved for their warmth and composure begins to reveal what the warmth was built on top of. It requires a recalibration. The career looks different. The smile looks different. The television appearances look different. Paper Roses sounds different. Not worse. Not less skilled or less genuine. But heavier. Weighted with the knowledge of what was already present in the child who recorded it and could not yet say what she was carrying. That weight is not a diminishment. It is an addition. It adds depth to a story the world thought it had already fully received. Because what Marie Osmond's life reveals, across its full arc, is something that extends well beyond her particular biography. It reveals the gap between the stories we tell about the people we make famous and the lives those people are actually living. It reveals the specific cruelty of early fame for a child who has already been harmed, because fame does not create safety. It creates an audience. And an audience, however loving, is not the same as a witness. An audience watches. A witness sees. For most of her life, Marie had an enormous audience and very few witnesses. The witnesses came later. Through therapy. Through the careful excavation of a past she had been trained to perform around rather than through. Through the decision, made incrementally and at enormous personal cost, to stop letting her public image do the emotional work that her actual healing required. She did not stop performing. That is not the shape her healing took. She continued to work, to create, to build, to give in the extraordinary ways that her philanthropy has demonstrated across decades. The Children's Hospital charity she helped create has raised figures that approach the scale of institutional transformation. That is not the productivity of someone who has given up on the world. That is the productivity of someone who decided that what was done to her in the dark would not be the final definition of what she was capable of in the light. But she also stopped pretending. That distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Continuing to work and stopping to pretend are not contradictions. They are the two things that real survival actually looks like. You do not abandon your life to prove you were hurt. You do not stop functioning to demonstrate the seriousness of the damage. You keep moving, because life requires it and because you are capable of it. But you stop maintaining the fiction that the movement was always effortless. That the smile was always spontaneous. That the composure was a reflection of inner peace rather than a skill developed under extraordinary pressure in extraordinary circumstances. The title of her story, as it actually unfolded across her life, was never really about a single naming. It was about a woman who was handed a public identity before she had a private one. Who learned to protect that identity with a discipline that the world mistook for ease. Who carried something in silence because everything around her had taught her that silence was the price of belonging to the life she was living. Who began, slowly and at genuine cost, to replace the discipline of concealment with the harder and more liberating discipline of honesty. And who, in doing so, did not destroy the image the world had built of her. She made it real. That is the thing about finally speaking. It does not erase what came before. It does not retroactively undo the decades of careful management or render the warmth performed across those decades somehow false. It contextualizes it. It gives it weight and dimension and the particular kind of meaning that only difficult truth can provide. The Marie Osmond who sang Paper Roses at 12 years old was already carrying something the microphone could not pick up. The Marie Osmond who smiled across a television screen for decades was already navigating a private landscape of damage and recovery and the exhausting daily labor of appearing intact. The Marie Osmond who finally began to name what had happened to her was not becoming a different person. She was becoming a visible one. And visibility, for someone raised to perform rather than to be known, is not a small thing. It is everything. Because the girl who was harmed before she had words for it deserved to be seen. Not as a symbol of resilience. Not as a cautionary tale about the cost of fame. Not as a cautionary tale about the entertainment industry's willingness to consume its youngest and most vulnerable participants without asking what it might be consuming alongside the talent. She deserved to be seen as a person. Complex, wounded, capable, searching, surviving, and finally, after everything, telling the truth not because it was safe but because it was necessary. That is what changes everything. Not the naming alone. But the decision behind the naming. The decision that what happened to her mattered enough to speak. That she mattered enough to speak. That the child who learned silence as survival had grown into a woman who understood that silence, held long enough, stops protecting you and starts costing you the very self you were trying to protect. She paid that cost for a long time. And then she stopped. That is the real story of Marie Osmond. Not the records or the television show or the famous family or the decades of professional reinvention. The real story is the one that was always running beneath all of those things, quiet and persistent and waiting with enormous patience for the moment when the woman who had learned to hide behind her smile decided that the smile had earned the right to mean something true. It took longer than it should have. It always does. But it happened. Piece by piece. Year by year. Disclosure by disclosure. Until the image the world had held of her for decades finally cracked open and revealed something far more valuable than the polished surface ever could. Not a celebrity. A person. And that, after everything, is the only story worth telling.